Shalom. I am Rabbi Nathan Davidovich speaking to you on behalf of the webyeshiva.org, speaking to you from Ephraim, Israel. I'm going to speak about this week's Torah reading, Parsha MISHPATIM, and how it can help us heal our broken hearts. Here in Israel, and hopefully every civilized person in the world, have their hearts broken by the return of 4 bodies held by the terrorist Hamas for 16 months. Oded Lifshitz and the Bibi family, the mother and 2 toddlers, who were kidnapped and killed in captivity. We held out hope for these 16 months for their safe return, but it wasn't meant to be. What message can we learn from this week's Torah as to how to cope with the scope of this tragedy? As our Prime Minister Rabbi said a few minutes ago, the blood of our loved ones cries out to us. In this week's Parsha, it talks about loaning something to somebody and taking collateral of a garment, and says if that's the only garment that they need, you have to return it. And it says, Kihi kasus lavado hi simlas laoro vayishkav. He says if it's the only available clothing, this is what covers the skin, how else can your neighbors sleep? So then it says v'hoya, and therefore, Ki yitzak elai v'shemati ki chanun ani. Therefore, if that person cries out to me, I will pay heed, I will listen to him, because I am compassionate. And the language of v'hoya, and when a person cries out, the language of v'hoya is normally a sign of joy, of happiness. And how can crying out to God be a sign of happiness? What kind of happiness is there? If a person is going through suffering, as we've been going through right now, how does our crying out to God symbolize joy? So the Mojitzer Rebbe says when a person is found in the deepest difficulty, he's got to have strength with his emunah, his faith in God. And he relies only that God will save him, and God will bring us out of this great tragedy into great light. He says, even therefore, even at the time you're crying out to God, you shouldn't be stuck in depression, but you should cry out to God out of joy and emunah, faith in God, bitochen, trust in God, that ultimately God will save us. And the strength of emunah is the strength that lets us get through the difficult tragedies. Rav Aaron Lichtenstein Zal, in 1999, gave a class and gave a class about the living through the Holocaust and how does a Jew cope with the fact of the Holocaust? He asks a number of questions, and he asks, one of the answers is that God hid his face from us. But then the question is why? He says, was the situation so dire that we really deserve for God to hide his face from us? He says, for those of us who believe, who have emunah, it is preferable to remain with the question and with the faith that surrounds it, rather than to try and snatch at excuses of one kind or another. He says, we cannot, nor will we ever be able to provide an adequate explanation of what happened. Someone once said, in response to a question as to whether he believed an explanation would ever be found for the Holocaust, I hope not. A woman once asked my neighbor, Leib Rachman, a Holocaust survivor, where was God during the Holocaust? He replied, he was with us. That is the only response. I am with him in distress. Anochi imo b'tzara. The question exists, but we're unable to supply an explanation for even the smallest details of history's course because we can't see the entire picture. How much greater, then, is our inability to explain an event of this magnitude? Similarly, how do we explain an event of the massacre of October 7th? And he goes on to say, we're not judged by our ability to create convoluted explanations. Our test lies in not forgetting and learning for the future, learning lessons for the future. And he says, we as Jews have to strive for a higher level of love for our fellow Jews, not just on the basis of our communal fate of the past, of what has happened to us, but on the basis of our destiny and our common future. And he says, one of the messages of the Holocaust, paradoxical as it seems, is that of faith. If a person experiences a period of intense difficulty and his faith wavers a little, and as a result of his troubles, he has to remember those Jews who lived through the inferno and persevered with perfect, pure faith. People who in the midst of the hideous events which they experienced continued to believe and persisted in their scrupulous observance of mitzvot. A person has to remember that each of us is capable of being an Avraham Avinu, someone who believes even if he's alone in his belief. Someone once said that to be a believing Jew means to be the last Jew on earth and still to believe. A great lesson in living with the moon and living with faith is by looking at Reb Zusha of Anipol. And they tell a story that every morning at the conclusion of the services, he would open his window and lean his head out the window, lift his eye to the heaven and say, Master of the world, Zusha is hungry. And every morning, his attendants would wait until he heard that, and he'd bring him breakfast. And one morning, the attendant thought to himself, why doesn't Reb Zusha ask me directly for the meal? Who does he think he's fooling, calling out to God like that? He knows I'm going to bring him food every day. So he decided he's going to test him. The next morning, he wouldn't bring him food. He would just see what would happen and see how Reb Zusha would look for his meal. The next morning, Reb Zusha got up as usual, before daylight, and as he did every morning, he went to the town mikveh to immerse himself to get ready for the day's holy work. It had been raining a lot in Anatoly, and the streets were already mud, rivers of mud. So in order to get from one side of the street to the other, he had to cross a narrow planks that were laid across the flowing mud. And as he was crossing in the direction of the mikveh, a man who he didn't recognize, the guest in town, was coming to him from the other side. And he saw Reb Zusha, this emaciated man dressed in rags. The stranger yelled out, itinerant, and with a hearty laugh jumped up and down on the plane, causing Reb Zusha to fall into the mud. Reb Zusha didn't say a word. He calmly picked himself up and continued on his way to the mikveh, while the stranger went off to the distance and checked into the inn where he was staying. And he couldn't help but brag about what he had done to the innkeeper. And the innkeeper asked the guest to describe this itinerant who he threw into the mud. And he clapped his hand and he said, oh my God, you know what you did? That was not some itinerant, that was the great Rabbi Zusha. Now it was the turn of the guest to cry out, oy vey. Zusha was known to all as a holy man and as a tzaddik. The guest cried out, wow, what am I going to do now? Don't worry, said the innkeeper. Listen to me. I know what you should do. Reb Zusha spends many hours every morning in prayer. When he's finished, he goes into his private room next to the shul. He opens his window and anybody can see how he leans out, lifts his eyes towards heaven, and calls out, Master of the world, Zusha is hungry and desires to eat something. I'll prepare some cakes and some schnapps for you to take to him. When you hear him call out to the Creator, go immediately with this gift and offer it to him and beg his forgiveness. I'm sure he'll forgive you. That morning, like every morning, after his prayers, Zusha went to his room, opened the window, and called, "Master of the world, Zusha is hungry." The attendant, who was testing him out, held his ground and folded his arms together and said, "Let's see. Let Hashem bring his cake that morning." Suddenly the door to the shul opened, and a man holding a large plate of cakes and a bottle of schnapps came into the room of Zusha, put the cakes on the table, and then he fell on the floor in grief, asking him for forgiveness. So then the attendant came to understand that it's really the master of the world who brought Reb Zusha his breakfast that morning. And that's what we learn from that story, and that's what we have to learn in this time of great sorrow and great trouble, that we have to have emunah, even though we don't understand. Just as we didn't understand the Holocaust, we don't understand why these people had to be massacred horribly on October 7th. We have to have emunah and strengthen our faith in God and our love for each other, our love for each of our fellow Jews, to look to the future and try to be better, try to be the best Jews and human beings that we can. Thank you for listening on behalf of the webyeshiva.org. Shabbat Shalom. May we hear only happy tidings, good news in the future.